Before we go into our interview today, I wanted to let everyone know we have a new sponsor for our Energy Question podcast, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, or USOGA for short. First established in 1917, USOGA has been an effective and creative voice for the industry for more than a century now. USOGA is dedicated to educating the public, policymakers, and legislators at the federal, state, and local levels about the value of the domestic oil and natural gas industry. If you're in the industry and not currently a USOGA member, please consider joining the association as a way of helping it tell your story to the policymakers whose actions impact everything you do each and every day. You can start that process by contacting USOGA through its website, usoga.org. Thanks so much to USOGA for sponsoring the Energy Question podcast. And now on with our show.
Hello, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm your host, David Blackmon, and my very special guest, returning guest today, is the great Irina Slav, great energy writer, writes at oilprice.com. She has her own Substack. I think it's irinaslav.substack.com, right? And my podcasting partner on the Energy Realities podcast every Monday morning. Great way to start the week. If you're not familiar with that podcast, you need to tune into it. It's a lot of fun and a lot of fantastic information. Irina, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me, David.
How is the weather in Bulgaria, right?
It's sunny but chilly, which is amazing because it's January and usually we have about 25 degrees at this time of the year. And I'm being ironic, just in case anyone thinks I'm being serious. Yeah, it's January, it's winter, it's cold. We even had some snow, which is not such a frequent occurrence in southern Bulgaria, but we did have some snow.
Well,
must be global warming.
It must be, yes. Everything else is, so that must be too. It's been kind of my impression, anyway, is that it's been kind of another fairly mild winter overall across Europe, right? Is that right or not?
I'm not sure. I think this winter was more normal than last winter because remember that massive snowstorms in Germany in, what was it, late November or early December?
Right.
But from what I can remember from the past, it's fairly normal. Must be really disappointing to weather extremists.
It must be, yes. But, I'm sure they're all sitting
around. Sorry to disappoint.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, I wanted to start today. You have a great piece out on Substack this morning that caught my eye because it's about one of my least favorite topics, ESG. It's titled ESG From Hype to Gripe, and I wanted to start off giving you a chance to talk about what you're writing about there.
Thank you. Well, it was a few news reports that caught my attention. In one of them, the Wall Street Journal, I think, was saying that business executives no longer talk about ESG. They changed the wording because, as far as I could understand, ESG has become sort of a toxic phrase. It's not that they're not doing ESG. It's not that they're not pursuing net zero targets and trying to reduce their carbon footprint or whatever they claim they're doing, but they are not calling it ESG. And there was a hilarious quote from the CEO of French insurance company AXA, who recently went to the US and talked to asset management executives there, and they told him not to use ESG. And he said, how should I call it? And apparently there is no good answer, but you shouldn't use ESG because it might get you in trouble. All those bad Republican governors prosecuting companies for discriminating against certain industries in favor of other industries. But it's even funnier in the European Union because now I see the European Parliament has passed new stricter regulations regarding greenwashing. So basically, you can't say you're doing something that is positive for the environment unless you can prove it, I expect, in the greatest detail. And actually, my husband told me the other day that advertising that says we are being good to the environment because we planted trees is no longer allowed.
Wow.
Which is, again, yeah, it's because of these new regulations. You can't say you're reducing your carbon footprint. Say if you're a bottled water company, you can't advertise that you are trying to offset your emissions by planting trees, because apparently that's greenwashing. And I used to think that carbon offsetting is a big deal for the transition. I mean,
Oh, sure.
everyone was saying that one of the ways to reduce emissions is to offset the emissions that you have to generate. But apparently not. Apparently that's greenwashing. It's fascinating. It's getting increasingly complicated, this transition.
I wonder how Al Gore, someone like Al Gore, who has become a 300 millionaire, selling car, involved in carbon credit selling ventures. He's made himself fabulously wealthy in that realm. I kind of wonder how he would view a regulation like that, because it seems to me it would be cutting into his business, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's a
yeah.
great question. Doesn't
Yeah.
he do disclosures, or does he
Well,
get rich as a private person?
well, I'm sure he being Al Gore, he has some sort of personal exemption from any reporting requirements.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Of
yeah.
course, because he's Al Gore, and
Yeah.
that's how the world works. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
double
wonder too,
standard.
also, what about, I wonder also, this brings to mind, what about a wind farm that cuts down tens of thousands of trees to clear the land to put up its big windmills? Does this prevent a wind farm developer from now saying they're good for the environment? And that they can't talk about how much good they're doing for the environment because they cut down all those trees. It seems like the inverse of this also ought to be taken a look at, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
It
anyway,
should, but it's not happening,
yeah, obviously. Larry Fink, of course, kicked off this whole nonsense last summer about we're not going to talk about ESG
Yeah.
internally anymore. And what he was really saying, and I think you wrote a piece about that back then in real time,
Probably.
that all he's doing is talking about changing the language around how he talks
Right.
about ESG,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's what we see. I mean, none of that's going away. So it's like so many things. The facade is different than what's really happening behind
Yeah,
the
but
scenes.
it's not for most businesses. I think it's not because they really want to do this, but they're being pressured by regulators.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they have to report their emissions and track them and report and track and report, and they're being forced into it. But they're not talking about it. I think as managers don't want to talk about it anymore because of what happened last year, all those outflows from so-called clean energy funds, which turned out to be not so clean energy, because basically they have big tech
And that
and a
was a
few
big
maybe
outflow, right?
Tesla. Yeah.
Was it like $5 trillion or something like that out of those
Oh,
funds?
I don't know. I saw some figures. They weren't for the whole year. They were for the first half or something. But there were several hundred billions in outflows. So,
Well,
yeah.
anyway. So another thing I wanted to bring up, that we had this court decision recently in your country, in which I think it was the country's Bulgaria's Supreme Court
The Constitutional
denied
Court.
the Constitutional Court. Excuse me.
That's
uh,
okay.
no, that's so, but it's denying a big solar developer the ability to clear cut land to put in solar power, right? And condemn what in it, farmland that's in question
Yeah,
as a part
farmland,
of that case.
agricultural land. Yeah, yeah. Well, what's interesting? When I saw the report in Euractiv, it's supposed to be a trusted source.
Yeah.
I tried to find some news reports in Bulgarian meaning. I didn't find anything. But I found the background, which is that last year, the new government, which they're trying to run the country into the ground for the shortest possible time. So this government wanted to push some constitutional reforms, among which I gather was allowing the construction of utility scale solar and wind, renewable energy installations on agricultural land. And the president, thank God, took this to the Constitutional Court because he said it's unconstitutional. Apparently, according to the Euractiv report, the Constitutional Court ruled against those proposed reforms. But I was surprised. But here's the thing. We're a country that's notorious for its corruption, although I now believe that every country is basically equally corrupted.
Yes.
Depending on the level. Some are, some have corruption at the higher levels, some have corruption at all levels, such as Bulgaria. Indeed, you're not allowed to build a solar farm on agricultural land that is in use. There's some sort of classification of land, agricultural land, from land in use, land that is not in use because it's depleted or whatever. You can build there.
Right.
So I was thinking that's pure speculation on my part. I want to make this clear. But knowing what I know about how business is done in Bulgaria, it shouldn't be too hard for some big businessmen with the right contacts and the right amount of money to pay the right people to have, say, a field reclassified from agricultural land fit for purpose to abandoned, depleted agricultural land and build the solar farm. And we actually have a very interesting case right here in my region, which is the best region for solar in Bulgaria because it's in the south and it's flat. About 15 miles from us, someone built the second largest solar farm in the country. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's boasting about it. There is no information to be found online about this farm, but it exists. And it is smack in the middle of fields, agricultural land. Now, why is nobody talking about it? Probably that's why, because it was built on agricultural land that should have been used as agricultural land, but somebody paid the right people. So, yeah, I wouldn't be too happy about this decision because whatever the court decides, it's what matters is what people do.
Right. And where all the money's flowing.
And whether these rules are actually enforced.
Yeah, and so the radio silence about the project, of course, brings up the point of the media's complicity in all of this, right?
Yeah.
It's not just in Bulgaria, it's in the United States, it's all across Europe, really all over the Western world, I think. And whether it's the case is the same in Asia and Africa, I'm not sure. But I don't know how, other than what you and I and so many others now are doing in our own efforts, to get the facts out about this stuff. How do you get past the media monolith? You and I both have platforms we write for, and that gets a certain amount of attention. But man, it's just overwhelming what the other side has access to, isn't it?
Yeah, it is overwhelming. And they have their, decades-long reputations on their side. But I've recently noticed, I don't know if you've noticed it, I don't know if you read the Financial Times regularly, but they have become as bad as The Guardian.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
They used to be okay, but it has become horrible. I mean, there was this report the other day. The article led with extreme weather. All these staple phrases of the transition, that was in the lead. That's not news reporting. I'm really sorry. It's very sad to see
that's
this.
depressing, actually, with that.
Yes, it is.
The Economist as well, and so many of the journals that, even the Wall Street Journal to some extent in America, that used to be reliable, that you could count on for telling the story straight, are now just completely in the tank. And slant their stories and really report outright falsehoods on a regular basis. And it's really, there's hardly anyone else other than you and me and the people we work with, and maybe 50 or 60 writers and podcasters around the country trying to get things out that are actually true. And it's really kind of a David versus Goliath kind of situation where public
it is,
information.
but let's not forget that David beat Goliath.
Well, that's true. He did. Yes.
Yeah. And people are starting to get really fed up with the propaganda. They are fed up with being told constantly that whatever they do is wrong. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for the climate. So there's
I feel that way too. I mean, that's something I wanted to ask you about. Do you feel that the pendulum's kind of starting to move back again?
I certainly hope so.
Yeah.
And I think it is happening because they are overdoing it. I think I've argued this in previous Substack. The transition crusaders or the climateers or however you like to call them, they are so overdoing it because they think we're idiots, but we have not yet become the sort of idiots that will keep on, consuming the propaganda and say nothing about it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think we saw an indication of that at the recent WEF conference last week when the new president of Argentina went over there, Milei, and made this 23-minute speech lambasting everything they do and stand for and telling them they're going to fail and they are the problem, not the solution. And there were several other speakers who delivered similar messages there. And that's the first time I can remember that happening at a WEF conference. Perhaps it's happened before, but it was pretty amazing to me that he, it took guts for him to go over there and do that, I thought.
Yeah, he's not one to mince his words. I understand. And what actually this speech, I don't know if it rattled the elite gathered in Davos, but he exposed the complacency of the people who believe they are leading the world.
Right.
They really thought, apparently, and probably still think, that nothing can challenge their position as world leaders. Although who appointed Klaus Schwab, we all wonder. But
well,
and
this that organization up, don't you, in the United States, was Henry Kissinger. Klaus Schwab was an acolyte.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yes.
Oh,
and Henry Kissinger was very much, and the Rockefeller family were very much involved setting up Klaus Schwab, the Anyway. And so Henry's finally died at age 100, and I just wonder if the WEF is beginning to pass on into old age as well. I kind of hope so.
I don't know. We all hope so, but we'll see. I think their arrogance will bring them down. Their arrogance and hubris and complacency.
Well, we have of course, this is a big election year, a big year for elections in Europe and the United States, Canada as well. We see these big protests. Of course, in the U.S., our media is incredibly, ridiculously substandard in reporting on international affairs. But we do see on social media the video clips of the big trucker and farmer protests happening in the Netherlands and then in Germany and now in France. There was one over the weekend.
Yeah.
That to me is an indicator of just general social unrest and dissatisfaction with the ruling class. And I just wonder, you're there on the ground in Europe. Are you feeling and seeing that in real time where you are?
Well, no, not here. I mean, the last time Bulgarian farmers protested was together with Polish and Romanian farmers about Ukrainian wheat coming into the European Union without certification, without anything, and basically killing their business. But perhaps it's only a question of time before ours rise too. What I see is what you see. I see it on social media. I don't read Bulgarian media unless I absolutely have to, because something specific has happened, because I know how the reporting is done, which you described fairly well about US media. It's the same here. But I see these protests, and it's really encouraging that the protests are spilling over from Germany, from the Netherlands. I do believe that it says what you just said, that people have had enough. This is genuine civil unrest. Now, where this unrest would lead, we don't know. It probably won't overthrow governments, but it might shake them up enough that they maybe pause for a second and start thinking, although I doubt this. So the only thing we can look forward to are the elections coming this year. And in Europe, these would be the most important ones, would be the European Parliament elections.
Yeah.
And remember that commentary Tammy emailed us a few days ago, this Bloomberg commentator who said that there are so many elections taking place this year, but this isn't necessarily good news for democracy.
Right, elections are bad for democracy.
Yeah, hundreds of millions of people are going to vote this year, but more voting doesn't mean more democracy.
Right.
Yeah, because we will be probably voting for the wrong parties. Sorry, that's what democracy is all about.
Yes.
And Germany, that's why Germany, a very democratic country, is trying to ban the main opposition party ahead of the elections.
Yeah. Well, similar things happening in Poland. I mean, Donald Tusk somehow weaseled his way into becoming, and now he's just arresting members of the opposition party and
it's
people
horrible.
I mean, just outright Hitler-style dictatorship now in Poland.
Yeah, and the EU is saying nothing, which again brings me to my biggest pet peeve, if I could even call it a pet peeve: double standards.
Yeah. I mean, what Tusk is doing in Poland is destructive to the very concept of democracy and free republic, and it's horrible for the people there.
Yeah.
And that had been a country that I had looked at and thought, well, there's hope in Europe because Poland's there, and now you got this guy running rampant, and gosh, I'm really very concerned about what's happening.
That doesn't mean that the previous guys were perfect or very good. They were very, very conservative.
Right.
But they weren't arresting people and shutting down state-owned media channels. So I don't know what's happening in Poland. Everyone's gone crazy.
Well, this all brings me to the topic. One of my favorite stories from the past week is this Portuguese CEO, and I'm going to get his name right here, Miguel Stilwell de Andrade, the CEO of a Portuguese utility company, EDP, said that overly complex...
it wasn't Galp, it was EDP, sorry. Yeah,
EDP. Overly complex, burdensome permitting processes among European nations cause new energy projects to stall and be canceled before they can be completed. And he complained that everything was so much more complicated in Europe from a permitting standpoint than it is even in the United States. I think that's actually true. I've heard that from CEOs of other companies as well. What do you see as any potential whatsoever for streamlining the energy permitting processes in how many nations in Europe?
27
nations, because it's all nation by nation, right? I mean, there's this umbrella organization at the EU.
For now, they can't force us to permit them within the space of 2 weeks. Well, it's a very, very interesting topic, this, because you know how the European Union has been pushing for shorter permitting procedures. But it's that same European Union that has for years made everything more complicated because of its high standards. You know, you have to have detailed environmental impact assessments or whatever they are calling it. Everything should be done properly to uphold the high European Union standards. And this is why it takes so long. In addition to, of course, the absolutely practical issue of connecting a new solar farm, a big solar farm, to the grid. I mean, the grid operator will need to somehow accommodate it. that's why in Bulgaria, for example, we have limits on how many people in a village can have rooftop solar if they're going to sell to the grid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because this additional load, which will be intermittent, will have to be managed somehow. The grid has to be adjusted, so they're putting limits, and this all combines to make for long permitting times. And I'm sorry, but I don't see how the European Union can solve this particular problem unless indeed it tries to mandate that we permit new wind and solar within weeks, which would go against its own rules.
Right.
Probably.
And what people, of course, in the United States, I spent 20 years working those processes in my career. And, what you find is pretty much all of the delays and obstructions to obtaining permits and all the regulations that you have to comply with are related to laws, major laws like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, that are designed to protect the environment, protect endangered species, and protect public and individual safety and health. And so, what are you going to do? Are you going to streamline this by, rescinding some of the protections for
violating your own laws?
Right. And it's the same thing in Europe, right? I mean, that's what most of those delays are about, isn't it? Environmental and endangered species.
Probably, yeah.
And so, how do you ever really streamline that without infringing on individual rights?
They will have to change the laws, and I think this is one big reason why the current crop of so-called leaders in Brussels are so afraid of the next parliamentary elections, European Parliament elections, because they are really expect that a lot of so-called far-right parties will win more seats.
Yeah. And far-right is anybody
interfere
to the
with
right.
that transition plan.
The far-right is anyone to
is
the right of Ursula von der Leyen, right? Or Klaus Schwab. Yeah. That's how it is in the United States too. Anyone to the right of Chuck Schumer is far right. Yeah. It's crazy. It's insane. And my God, we're already bumping up against time here. We're just getting started. I may have to change this to an hour-long format. These 30-minute discussions really don't get everything in that I'd like to get in. But before we go, tell everyone where they can find you and follow what you're doing.
I think you already said it. My Substack is Irina Slav at substack.com. The podcast on Monday. Yeah, and X. You can find me on X, where I mostly rant using links to news reports that are ridiculous. Did you see they're going after coffee, by the way?
What? No. What?
Oh, yeah. Drinking coffee is bad because producing coffee is very, very emissions intensive.
I don't care. I'm going to have my 2 cups every morning. And it doesn't matter to me. I'm sorry, folks. That's my ESG
going to
violation.
make you pay for it. That's the problem. They can make us pay for all this.
Well, of course they can, and they do. I mean, we're already paying.
They'll do their best.
Yeah, we're already paying to maintain 2 separate power grids, right? The one that makes the liberals feel better about themselves, and the one that keeps the lights on. And so it's stuff is never ending. I almost uttered a cuss word there, so I guess it's time to wrap up. Irina, thank you so much for being back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, David. It was great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'll see you next Monday.
All right.
You too, David. You too.
Bye-bye.